Chapter 7, March 31st, 1862. Early in the morning the slaves were roused, given a quick breakfast, and sent to their work areas. Cuff felt better, but his hands were still torn and blistered. He knew he couldn't last an hour digging gravel on the parapet and wrestling with the barrow. But if he complained to one of the guards, he'd be asking for trouble. Looking around, he saw a husky young man who was one of the kitchen squad. Cuff fell into step with him, showed him his hands, and explained the problem. The young man was sympathetic and agreed to exchange places with Cuff for the day. To seal their bargain, Cuff gave him a small, rusty penknife that he'd brought in his sack. Smiling with pleasure, the man headed toward the trenches while Cuff joined the slaves waiting at the cook tent. The spy's second day behind the lines was much less painful than the first. He was assigned to a group that took meals to the crews manning the heavy artillery. Since these posts were spread out along the Confederate front, it gave him a chance to learn more about the fortifications. He eavesdropped on the conversations around him and learned that fresh reinforcements were expected. He also heard that General Robert E. Lee had visited Yorktown and didn't think the defenses would hold against a strong Union attack. All of this, he knew, would be of interest at McClellan's headquarters. During the afternoon, while carrying pots and buckets with a slave named Jabez, Cuff saw a long row of fat logs lined up behind banks of earth. They were pointed south, and soldiers were busy painting them black. "What's them logs for?" he asked his companion. "They're Quaker guns," Jabez replied. Cuff didn't have to play act. His puzzlement was real. "I never heard of no Quaker guns before." Jabez grinned. "Quakers is very religious people, Cuff, peace lovin'. They don't hold with no wars. They won't do no shootin', see? And neither will them guns." Studying the painted logs, Cuff realized how convincing they would look when seen through a Union telescope. He made a mental note to pinpoint the fake cannons on his secret map. Several hours later, he and Jabez were filling canteens at a pump for one of the gun crews. Nearby, he noticed a heavy-set gentleman in dark civilian clothes talking to a group of officers. Cuff recognized him as a peddler, supposedly a good friend and strong Union sympathizer. He often came to the Union camp with his wagon, staying for hours on some pretext or other. Straining his ears, Cuff caught some of the man's conversation. He was so surprised he had to fight to keep himself from spinning around and staring. The man was a clever Confederate spy who picked up data on his peddler trips, then passed it to the rebels. Bending over the pump, Cuff heard him boasting of his success in luring Union patrols into ambushes, causing the death of many. The young woman thought of James Vesey and felt herself go hot with pain and anger. The rebel agent was talking away, unaware that he was doomed. But Emma wasted no sympathy on him. Her cause was just. She had a job to do, and fate had thrust this turncoat into her hands. She'd report the peddler to headquarters. His next visit to the Union lines would be his last visit anywhere. Slowly the long day passed. Then the sun dipped to the horizon and Cuff began making plans. He had a lot of valuable information and had to get back as quickly as possible, but it wouldn't be easy. Slipping into the rebel camp was simpler than finding a way to break out of it. Except for his hour of liberty, he had no time alone, and at night he'd be penned with the other blacks in their compound. If he was caught outside that area, he'd be shot as a spy or hanged as a slave attempting to escape, and neither option was very appealing. During his free hour, Cuff wandered toward the picket line west of the new parapet. Here the gap between the two forces was less than a mile. He knew that in emergencies, reliable black men were allowed briefly to stand picket duty. Perhaps a black guard could be convinced or bribed to let him slip through. Cuff drew closer to the outposts. Suddenly a young Confederate lieutenant came striding toward him, a frown on his face, his red mustache bristling. Cuff swallowed hard and got ready for trouble. "Yo!" Boy, the lieutenant barked, come along with me. The officer marched Cuff to a forward position, and the trooper in charge saluted smartly. Corporal, the lieutenant said, put this one in the post where the man was shot. He'll do for now, until I can send up a proper replacement. When he left, the corporal looked at Cuff angrily. I don't hold with letting your kind up here, but orders is orders. He shoved a Hanson rifle into Cuff's hands. Cuff recognized it as an Enfield carbine. Know what this is? It's a rifle, all pinned and loaded, the corporal growled. All you got to do is aim and pull the trigger. Cuff bobbed his head and smiled. Yes, sir, I understand. I knows how to use her. The corporal shoved Cuff roughly toward a small mound. Stand here, keep your eyes open, fire at anything in the valley that moves. He narrowed his cold eyes. You fall asleep on duty, boy, we'll shoot you like a dog. Cuff shook his head. Don't worry none, sir. I won't fall asleep. Too scared fall asleep. The corporal was gone before Cuff finished his sentence. Elated, he looked around, marveling at his wonderful luck. The sentries on each side were 50 or 60 feet away, no problem there, but he'd have to move soon before the lieutenant came back with a substitute. In minutes, a misty drizzle began. Clouds bunched overhead. Night closed in, and Cuff could no longer see the other pickets. Clutching his rifle, he stepped from the mound and tiptoed into the valley. The gloom and mist were so heavy now that he could barely see 2 feet ahead. Cat-like and silent, he slipped through the night, knowing that any sudden noise would bring a dozen shots crashing in his direction. Following his instincts, Cuff snaked across the open zone until he sensed that the Union lines were just ahead. But a night arrival was risky, and he didn't relish drawing sentry fire. Soaked to the skin, the weary spy crawled under a sheltering bush to wait for morning.